I had spent years watching certain people twist the truth into admiration. When I stepped into that meeting room on the morning everything shifted, I sensed a breaking point approaching. My name is Helena, 31 years old, and by then I had learned exactly when to push back and when to stay calm. The room filled with praise as my sister stood proudly at the front, while everyone celebrated the contract she claimed would transform our company. I listened in silence, already aware of the inconsistencies buried in the documents she refused to explain. When the noise settled, I rose from my seat and asked a direct question about the figures she had glossed over, especially the sections that contradicted every vendor record I had reviewed. The change in my sister's expression arrived instantly. Her confidence hardened into irritation, and her voice lifted with an edge that aimed to discredit me rather than address anything I had said. She threw her arm toward the door and shouted with a force meant to humiliate me in front of all those faces. "Get her out of here!" A ripple of uncertainty moved across the room as people exchanged hesitant looks, unsure whether to obey my sister or wait. I stayed where I was, folded my hands, and let her believe she held authority. Then the door opened. Every person in the room tensed when a man walked in. His steps were steady, his expression unreadable, and even before he spoke, the atmosphere shifted as if the truth had just entered with him. He looked toward the front and delivered 4 quiet words that wiped the color from my sister's face. She went pale so quickly it felt like the air had been pulled from her lungs. If you want to understand why those 4 words mattered and what followed after they were spoken, stay with me until the end, because nothing that happened next was accidental. In my family, nothing ever felt balanced, and that truth shaped every part of my childhood in ways I only understood much later. I grew up watching the weight of expectations settle unevenly on the shoulders of the people who shared my last name. My parents believed they were being fair, yet their decisions drew a clear line between who they celebrated and who they relied on. The company that defined our lives had been built long before I understood what responsibility meant. It began with my grandfather Walter, who had turned a small delivery route into a respected logistics business in Des Moines. His stories about the early years carried lessons about endurance and consistency, although those lessons reached me differently than they reached Fiona. While he spoke about perseverance to both of us, she absorbed the praise, while I absorbed the work. Fiona loved the spotlight that came with her position in the family, and I became familiar with the quieter burdens that no one else wanted. As kids, our differences became visible through small but persistent patterns. Whenever we completed a task together, my parents rarely looked past Fiona's retellings of what happened. She described everything as if she had done it alone, and they rarely questioned her. There were afternoons when we helped Walter organize old shipment records, and Fiona would leave halfway through only to return when the final box was sealed. When the task was finished, she eagerly ran to tell Mom that she had organized everything while I stood behind her, unsure whether correcting the story even mattered. Moments like that repeated themselves so consistently that I stopped keeping count. I learned to manage disappointment quietly. It became easier to invest my energy into finishing what needed to be done rather than waiting for someone to recognize how much effort it took. Fiona grew comfortable stepping into credit that didn't belong to her, and my parents unknowingly encouraged the habit by praising her confidence without noticing what it cost me. I rarely confronted any of it because I found more value in the skills I was learning than in the applause she collected so easily. There were times when I tried to talk to Mom about how it felt. She listened with a softness that made me think she understood, but her actions rarely changed. Dad repeated the same reminder each time, telling me that families worked best when everyone supported one another. The irony never escaped me, although I kept it to myself. Supporting Fiona often meant completing my own responsibilities before stepping in to handle the ones she ignored, yet no one acknowledged the imbalance. Through those years, I slowly discovered that competence had its own kind of power. Whenever a problem surfaced in the house, my parents sought my help first because they trusted me to finish things correctly. Fiona continued taking the lighter path, which allowed her to maintain the image she loved, while I shouldered tasks that required patience and clarity. Even though recognition rarely came my way, I understood that I was being prepared for challenges that would eventually demand more than outward charm. By the time we reached adulthood, the gap between us had become a quiet reality. Fiona expected admiration, and I expected responsibility. What neither of us anticipated was how sharply those expectations would collide once we both stepped into the company that carried our family name. 8 years ago, I stepped into the company with a mix of hope and uneasiness that wrapped itself around every decision I made during those early months. I knew the business carried decades of history, and I also knew I would have to earn my place without relying on anything other than my ability to learn quickly and contribute in ways that truly mattered. Fiona entered through a very different doorway, supported by the confidence that came from familiarity with authority and the comfort of knowing that most people expected her to succeed. I started at one of the lowest positions in the operations department, where every mistake became a lesson I never forgot. My tasks ranged from verifying shipment logs to updating digital inventories, and each assignment forced me to understand the system from the inside out. I observed how information moved, how delays formed, and how a single overlooked detail could ripple through the entire supply chain. The pace was demanding, yet I found stability in understanding the mechanics of the work, which helped me build credibility with the people who relied on accuracy to keep the company running. Fiona walked into a management role confident in her ability to command attention. Her team mirrored her energy, which often drew admiration from colleagues who valued presentation more than process. Mom praised her during family dinners, emphasizing her leadership, while Dad reminded me that starting from the bottom would help me understand the company in ways Fiona never could. I held on to those words whenever frustration threatened to distract me from what I wanted to achieve, because I believed the foundation I was building would matter someday. As the months passed, Fiona became known for her polished reports and persuasive proposals, though many of those proposals came from discussions she overheard or ideas she adopted from colleagues who trusted her too easily. The first time she took credit for something I had created happened during a quarterly strategy meeting, when I shared an improvement model with her the night before because she claimed she needed help clarifying a few segments. The next day, she presented the entire concept as if it had originated from her analysis, and the praise she received shifted the atmosphere in the room in a way that left me silent for several moments. I did not confront her because I needed to understand how far she was willing to go before deciding how to respond. I chose to let actions speak for me. I invested every spare hour into refining process maps and analyzing data trends that revealed inefficiencies no one had noticed. Small changes began to reduce delays, which eventually caught the attention of supervisors who valued dependable results. I never tried to highlight my accomplishments because I believed they would become visible through consistency rather than through announcements. Fiona continued to shine publicly while I grew quietly in the background, and even though resentment tried to surface at times, I reminded myself that genuine progress rarely needed applause in order to hold value. Each year added a layer of experience I had not anticipated when I first walked into the building. The responsibilities increased, and I learned how to balance pressure with clarity, which made me far more prepared for leadership than I initially realized. While Fiona maintained the spotlight, I built the structural knowledge that kept it from collapsing. Our paths moved forward in ways that seemed parallel, although the distance between them grew with every project completed and every challenge met. By the time the company announced plans to negotiate a major new contract, I understood that our differences would soon collide again, only this time the stakes involved far more than recognition or praise. One random afternoon, while I was reviewing a set of shipping reports for a department that had requested my help with a system error, a familiar folder name surfaced on the screen and drew my attention with an odd sense of unease. I had seen Fiona's documents countless times, yet something about the placement of this file tucked among unrelated requests made me pause long enough to open it. I expected a routine proposal or an internal draft, although the moment the contract page loaded, a quiet heaviness settled across my chest, as if the numbers themselves carried a warning that demanded patience and clarity before I dared to continue. The first detail that pushed me to read more carefully was an unusual payment schedule that forced our company to shoulder costs long before the partner confirmed any deliverables. I reread the section several times, hoping I had misinterpreted a dense paragraph that looked as if it had been stitched together without any intention to protect us. The next section troubled me even more because it shifted liability toward our side in the event of shipment delays, mechanical issues, or customs complications that normally required shared responsibility. Every sentence felt crafted to trap the inexperienced, and I knew Fiona often rushed through contract reviews whenever praise was within reach. I tried to understand how she had overlooked so many warning signs, although the deeper I went, the clearer it became that these flaws were not mere oversights, but structural gaps designed to conceal something larger. I moved on to cross-check the partner's historical data through internal databases that tracked industry performance. The first record already raised a significant red flag due to a prior investigation into irregular financial movements that had never been fully resolved. I pushed further and found a pattern that repeated across several shipping quarters, in which this same group had shifted funds in ways that pressured smaller companies into covering their operational shortfalls. Their tactics resembled a cycle of concealed withdrawals followed by abrupt project abandonment once dependency had been established. Two firms documented severe losses after working with them, and one never recovered from the sudden capital drain. Each discovery tightened the knot forming in my stomach because the contract Fiona intended to sign mirrored the early phases of those exact schemes. I collected additional details to ensure that I was not misreading incomplete reports, then traced the negotiation trail Fiona had documented in her digital notes. Her comments reflected full confidence in the partner and suggested she believed the deal would elevate her reputation across the executive team. My attempt to share a subtle warning during an internal discussion later that afternoon resulted in an immediate dismissive reaction. She accused me of jealousy before I even finished my sentence, then claimed that I enjoyed undermining her work whenever she stood on the edge of recognition. She did not ask what I had found, nor did she question why a routine review had unsettled me enough to approach her directly. Her refusal to listen narrowed the options available to me because I could not allow the company to be pulled into a financial trap that would take years to recover from. I returned to my desk and reread the contract once more, while the tension inside me solidified into a quiet resolve. The more I examined the documents, the more certain I became that someone needed to speak before Fiona finalized the deal. She had already circulated an announcement draft that celebrated her pending achievement, and it was obvious she planned to present the contract at the upcoming meeting with full confidence in her success. I understood that confronting her directly again would only escalate our conflict without addressing the risks buried in the agreement. The responsibility now rested on me to raise the issue in the only environment where accountability could override pride. I knew that once the meeting began, I would challenge the contract in front of the leadership team if Fiona insisted on moving forward. 1 week later, the pivotal meeting finally arrived with an energy that made the entire company unusually alert, as if every conversation in the building was pulsing toward the same destination. Fiona took her seat near the front, completely confident the event would end, with her receiving praise that would echo through every department. Mom and Dad settled in nearby with expressions that already suggested pride, as if the outcome had been decided long before the meeting even began. I walked in with steady steps, because I knew the weight of what I carried and understood that this meeting would expose more than a disagreement between two sisters. Fiona began the presentation with a practiced smile that showed she had rehearsed this moment many times. She spoke about projected growth with a tone that implied she alone had dragged the company toward a brighter future. Every compliment from the executives around her seemed to feed the belief that she had become a savior. Comments about her flawless leadership filled the room until her confidence grew so inflated that she barely glanced at the notes she had prepared. I waited and listened as she discussed the contract she believed would secure her status. Each sentence made it more difficult to stay silent because I knew the truth would eventually collide with everything she was saying. When the chief operating officer invited questions from the team, I rose and felt every gaze turned toward me with a mixture of curiosity and doubt. I explained that I had reviewed some figures connected to the contract during a routine audit for another department and had found inconsistencies that required immediate attention. Fiona stiffened as if my words were an attack crafted for humiliation rather than a professional concern. I continued because the stakes were too high, and I could not let her interpretation distort what I needed to share. I laid out the discrepancies in the payment schedule and pointed out the structure of the risk clauses. Her face tightened with irritation as I listed the warning signs that matched the patterns of past financial collapses tied to the partner company. Before I finished my reasoning, Fiona shot up from her chair with a glare that revealed how fragile her composure truly was. She pointed at me as if I were an intruder rather than her sister. Her voice pierced the room with a rage that had been building ever since she believed she had secured her victory. She shouted with a force meant to shame me into silence and said, "Get her out of here." The executives exchanged uneasy glances because her reaction was so extreme that it shattered the polished image she had been constructing all morning. I remained exactly where I stood because panic would only reinforce the story she wanted everyone to believe. I steadied my breath while the room spun into confusion. A few managers whispered among themselves, uncertain whether they should intervene or pretend they had heard nothing. Fiona kept demanding action until the tension became thick enough to make several people shrink back in discomfort. I refused to move because truth did not require dramatics. It required presence. The conference doors opened behind us and several heads turned toward the sound. A man stepped inside with a calmness that quieted the scattered murmurs. As he walked farther into the room, his presence sharpened into someone I knew better than anyone else in the building. I recognized him as my grandfather Walter. The moment he appeared, Fiona's face lost every trace of color because she understood the authority he carried. He scanned the table, acknowledged the documents in Fiona's hand, and then delivered the 4 words that changed everything. He said, "The contract is void." He already knew about the contract after I called him early that morning when the irregularities finally became too clear to ignore. I told the room that I couldn't stand by and watch the company walk into a deal that would make everyone pay for one person's haste. I knew Fiona would dismiss any warning, so I turned to the only person who could look at the situation with clarity. As my words settled, the atmosphere in the room shifted, and several people lowered their eyes as if they had just understood a truth that had been in front of them all along. The next morning arrived with a tense stillness that felt unusual for a company that rarely paused for anything. Yet the moment I stepped through the hallway, I sensed that the air itself carried the weight of something irreversible. The executives gathered earlier than usual, and whispers faded the instant Walter requested a closed session for a review that would determine the integrity of our entire leadership structure. I took my seat quietly, aware that every gaze carried its own question about what the day might reveal. The head of internal auditing, who had always maintained a calm presence in even the most stressful periods, opened a thick folder that contained several months of financial activity linked to Fiona. It was the first time I heard the team articulate concerns that had apparently lingered beneath the surface concealed by her influence and the confidence she projected so effortlessly. The auditor spoke deliberately while presenting transactions that redirected operational funds toward an unregistered secondary account, a detail that caught the room off guard due to the precision with which the transfers had been hidden. No one interrupted as the team continued with statements gathered from multiple departments, each describing moments in which employees felt pressured to comply with decisions that bypassed standard procedure. A younger analyst who introduced herself with a trembling voice explained how she had been instructed to relinquish full credit for her designs, despite evidence showing that she had completed most of the conceptual work. The discomfort in the room grew heavy as she recounted the atmosphere of fear that surrounded any attempt to question Fiona's instructions. Another staff member described the quiet alterations Fiona made to performance metrics without sending reports to the supervisory board. The auditor confirmed these discrepancies with archived data that revealed changes to entire segments of the system adjusted in ways that benefited her position, while leaving other departments vulnerable to criticism whenever deadlines slipped. Each revelation shifted the room further away from the admiration that Fiona once commanded, replacing it with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning realization that her charm had disguised a deeper pattern. Mom and Dad eventually rose from their seats trying to defend Fiona by referencing her workload and the pressure they believed she shouldered alone. Their voices held more desperation than conviction, a tone that made the silence around them feel sharper than any accusation. Walter listened with a patience that only highlighted the seriousness of his role, and when he responded, he did so with a clarity that allowed no argument from anyone present. He stated that influence and favoritism could not stand above accountability, especially when the company's future depended on the truth. Internal auditing concluded that the inconsistencies required a full independent investigation, and the board reached an agreement without a single dissenting vote. The decision to suspend Fiona took only a moment, yet the impact settled heavily across every department represented in the room. I watched the realization surface on the faces around me that the image of excellence Fiona curated for years had fractured beyond repair. The session ended with the acknowledgement that the company would move forward only by examining every layer of the system she once controlled, ensuring that nothing remained hidden as the investigation progressed. 1 week after the investigation, a different quiet settled over the company, and it carried a clarity that no one could soften. What emerged from the final report was a portrait of choices my sister Fiona had tried to hide behind influence and charm, yet the evidence refused to bend in her favor. The internal team concluded that she had diverted company funds into a secondary account she never disclosed, and the explanation she offered unraveled the longer she attempted to hold on to it. The auditors presented a timeline showing how several transactions aligned with adjustments Fiona had made to the project files. They showed the committee where numbers were altered without permission, and how design changes had been implemented without review. Every detail painted a picture of someone who believed she would never face consequences, and each revelation deepened the silence in the room. I watched the faces around the long table shift from confusion to disbelief, and then to something close to resignation as the truth settled in. When the decision to terminate Fiona was announced, the room remained still, though the weight of it felt enormous. Her actions were ruled as ethical violations severe enough to restrict her eligibility for future senior positions in the industry, and the consequences became official the moment her badge was deactivated. I stayed seated as she left the building, surrounded by an uncomfortable hush that stretched across the hallway. Mom and Dad confronted me later that afternoon with a frustration that refused to acknowledge what the investigation had proven. They said I could have supported Fiona differently and insisted I should have protected the family name by staying silent. Their disappointment carried a bitterness I recognized from earlier years, yet it struck me in a place I thought had grown numb. I listened while they defended her with arguments built from emotion rather than fact, and the distance between us widened in a way I no longer tried to resist. Walter addressed the board shortly after, and his tone left no room for doubt. He removed Fiona from all inheritance considerations and made it clear that leadership demanded accountability rather than favoritism. When he later called me to his office, I expected a brief acknowledgement, yet he offered a new position shaped around the systems improvements I had built over the past years. His confidence in my work steadied something inside me that had felt shaken throughout the ordeal. Late that evening, after the official announcements were released, Fiona tried to reach me through several messages filled with a mixture of regret and desperation. She asked for a chance to explain, and she insisted she had reasons I never understood. I read each line while standing by my window, and the familiar ache of old family patterns returned for a moment. I chose silence instead of engagement because anything I said would only reopen wounds that needed to close. For the first time, I allowed the quiet to speak for me, and it marked the beginning of a boundary I should have drawn years ago. 3 months later, I looked back on everything with a calm I had rarely allowed myself to feel. The chaos that once wrapped around every corner of my life had slowly dissolved, giving way to a steadier rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar. My days carried a sense of clarity that had been missing for years, and I finally understood how much strength it took to let go of burdens that were never mine to carry. The department Walter assigned to me settled into a grounded pace, and the transition revealed a quiet truth that surprised even those who had doubted me. I saw how the team grew more confident when they were given direction rooted in fairness rather than pressure. The trust they placed in my leadership pushed me to rise each day with a focus that felt deeply earned rather than inherited. And the progress we built together showed me that stability could come from the simplest decisions made with integrity. The company found its footing again once the investigation faded, and the absence of turmoil allowed every division to breathe in a way I had never witnessed. Fiona struggled to navigate the consequences tied to her record, and the distance between her and my parents widened with an inevitability no one could reverse. I stopped trying to decode their silence because chasing their approval had never brought me anything except doubt. Choosing my own path felt less like defiance and more like stepping out of a room that had been dim for far too long. I moved forward with a certainty that did not need applause, and the quiet that followed felt unexpectedly freeing. I learned that boundaries within a family are not a betrayal, but a way to preserve one's sense of self, especially when loyalty is used as a shield for harmful behavior. Standing firm in a professional environment often means accepting that truth will unsettle those who rely on manipulation, yet honesty remains the only foundation strong enough to protect what matters. Speaking up may invite conflict, but silence always demands a greater cost. Thank you for staying with me until the final moment of this story. Your time and presence mean more than you realize, and I hope something within my journey resonates with your own experiences. I would love to hear how you navigate loyalty, fairness, or family expectations in your life. Feel free to share your thoughts or stories below so we can learn from one another.